In the last episode, we learned about how important it is to promote a healthy microbiome. It is the healthy microbiome that is necessary for the body to have optimal immune system function. What you eat and where you live and what you're exposed to can have a positive or negative effect on your microbiome. Even healthy soil can be effective to create a healthy microbiome. Today, we will be focusing on autoimmune disease relating to the digestive system, diseases such as colitis and Crohn's disease, celiac. We will also cover a major trigger in the autoimmune disease development, that is gluten sensitivity and celiac disease. You will even see how type 2 diabetes can be connected with gluten sensitivity and how it can be reversed. Find out different ways the digestive system can be tested to see if it is healthy or not, and the steps for treating the digestive diseases. You don't have to keep wondering how you can have a healthier gut. It will be revealed today.
We see an increasing number of people presenting with either functional, which is IBS type problems, or more pathological problems like Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. There's been a 25% increase in the last 15 years in the presentation of inflammatory bowel disease. This is absolutely a reflection of a loss of relationship between the environment which lives inside them and the human that's possessing that environment. So people become incapacitated, codependent upon strong painkillers or different types of medication. And the result of that is always leads to a compression of life choices. So when anybody presents either with an individual which has a distinct pathology they already have, or with a series of symptoms yet to be diagnosed for a pathology, but they're progressing in that way, they have had to give up aspects of their life. And nobody likes having bits of their life taken away without their own individual decision to make it happen. So I think humans adapt. And it's not until you give people back and it opens up that route, so it returns to function again, that they realized just how limited their choices have become.
Well, I say that gluten, it's undigestible to any human being. That's the first thing. So some people can react to this very strongly, some mildly, and some are not feeling anything at all. But it doesn't mean that if you doesn't feel it, it doesn't mean it's not harming you.
Exactly.
So what I ask patients is to give its body a chance. Give your own body a chance, quit for a month and see what's going on. If you don't feel any improvement, okay, maybe it's okay. It's a first step, you know. So people can try to give it a chance and see how your mind is working, your gut, your stomach, your energy, your muscles, your joints. You know, everything can change.
In your clinical practice, what % of people that follow your advice feel better as a result of that?
Maybe 80 to 90%.
Mine also is very similar that way.
Yeah.
Now in the US, we have...
I could say probably 100, but probably 90%.
You would sound like a fanatic.
Yeah, that's it. That's the point. That's the point.
So in the US, we have a little more sensitive testing now. So we're able to identify if there's a sensitivity to gluten without celiac disease more often. It's just the blood tests around the world that are not sensitive enough.
Of course, yeah.
And so asking patients to give it a personal trial and see 80 to 90% in your practice will do better.
Yeah, sure.
And what type of conditions do you see that calm down? Do you ever see autoimmune conditions calm down? And
Many.
if so, what type?
Many. Rheumatoid arthritis, uveitis, spondylitis ankylosis.
Ankylosing spondylitis.
Ankylosing spondylitis,
Yes.
sorry. And Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis. So
Yes.
this autoimmune disease I've seen many times to improve.
Yes.
And Hashimoto thyroiditis also many times. This is the most frequent one. So I see it almost every month. Patients decreasing its own antibodies when they quit gluten. So psoriasis as well.
Well, cross-reactivity is it's an immune dysfunction when the antibodies that are made against gluten, gliadin specifically, or maybe casein from milk, or milk butyrylphthalin from the dairy products. What happens for some patients is that their antibodies produced against specific foods mistake human tissue for that food. And there's no way to fix it at this point in our juncture of medical knowledge. So what happens is, if the patient continues to consume milk or gluten, that antibody that is cross-reacting with the human tissue destroys the tissue, because it thinks it's the gluten or the dairy it's supposed to be destroying. It's destroying tissue. It could be cerebellar, it could be bones, it could be thyroid, it could be heart. A variety of organs can be affected by this problem of cross-reactivity between foods and human tissues. From the ones that I included in the study, in the presentation, I talked about the gluten family proteins, IgG, not IgA, so this is non-celiac gluten sensitivity versus celiac disease. I included the dairy family proteins, and I did the lectins and agglutinins. Lectins and agglutinins were actually the highest, with 76% of patients who make antibodies against wheat germ agglutinin. As we're so focused on gluten these days, we've forgotten about wheat germ agglutinin as another big trigger of autoimmunity. The gliadin family proteins cross-react with human tissues. The wheat germ agglutinin binds to human tissue, and by binding to tissue, it causes autoimmunity against that tissue because it doesn't belong there, and the immune system's trying to get rid of it, ends up destroying tissue in the process. So wheat germ agglutinin was actually the one that had 76% of those patients who made antibodies against wheat germ agglutinin and other lectins and agglutinins reacted to one or more of their tissues.
Wow, 76%.
76%, that was the highest one.
Some foods that are healthy foods, biochemically, if you pull them apart and their constituents, the nutritional value, they're very healthy foods. But they're not healthy for you if your immune system looks at it and starts freaking out and causes you to be inflamed, right? So we can do those tests, but if they didn't want to do those, we know the foods that are the biggest offenders, right?
The
that
big ones.
Humans have not really, in the grand scheme of things, for the most of the time we've been on the planet, we've not eaten these things because they make us sick. In the modern human existence, we do, because they're crops that are easy to grow, they're drought resistant, they can feed a lot of people, provide a lot of calories, or they're sort of calories of convenience, but they're not the most optimal things to consume, because we're not designed to eat them. We don't make the enzymes, we don't have the organs to digest them. We're not ruminants. So we don't do good with grasses, or the seeds of grasses, or field grass grains. So that's why there's so much now awareness of gluten, gliadin, and a whole spectrum of other compounds that are in these types of foods. We're really not meant to eat them.
So people say, I don't eat grass. So what foods are we referring to?
Well, a lot of what we know as grains are cultivated modified grasses, really.
Right.
When you
They're
see
grasses.
them grow, you can see those, they have a structure like grass, and then they have that sort of those
seed heads
feathery
to 'em.
seed heads, like you can even see in certain types of grass in a lawn if you let it get, mature enough. So things like, wheat, rye, barley, all the classically gluten, gliadin containing grains can be problematic, and they're more problematic for certain individuals who have uniquenesses of their immune response to sort of freak out or overreact when they confront those things. And then if they have a leaky or hyperpermeable gut, it's even more of a problem. So the people who really have super severe reactions to these, like someone who has frank celiac disease, all these things are lining up, right? The stars are all lining up. They have leaky gut. They have the immune characteristics that they totally overreact to these things, and they become a runaway train, and they get a frank inflammatory bowel disease. But we certainly know at this point that it's not either that or you're fine with them. Like you're perfectly healthy or you have celiac disease. There's lots of shades of gray in between. And a lot of people aren't sick enough to get diagnosed with something like celiac disease, but they're sick enough from them to be miserable every day of their life. Have fatigue, have pain, have,
Some type of symptoms.
cognitive problems, ended up with autoimmune thyroid issues. They may get diagnosed with fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue or all kinds of things, and no one ever ties it to those foods that are ubiquitous in their diet because they're in all the processed foods.
We have this food protein that for many people is maybe just a neutral protein that's broken down by digestion, but in some people, based upon their immune uniqueness, it's seen as a foreigner. How could that, as what we consider a part of a good food, at least historical grains, be in some people really a poison? And this concept, food of one and poison of another, became real. And so then I started saying, well, maybe it's that this composition of this protein, this gluten, resembles something in that person's immune system that they see at a tissue level as a foreigner, and so that they suddenly start producing antibodies that are really very similar to what they would produce against a disease organism, but it cross-reacts with their own tissues. So now suddenly they have innocent bystander response that is damaging their tissues, producing the intestinal symptoms that are associated with classic celiac disease, but then also producing a systemic effect where the whole immune system becomes alerted. And now it's not just a localized effect, it's a systemic effect, so the gut can be connected to the brain, and you can get dementia from celiac disease. And I thought, well, now we have a second level of thinking. Not only maybe the body is not responding to itself, maybe the body's slightly transformed into non-self, and that remains yet to be. I'll come back to visit that. And also that there is not just a localized effect when the immune system is alerted in such a way, it could be a systemic effect, so you get multiple potential symptoms across different organs depending upon that person's own unique genetic characteristics. It's known in the medical literature that people who have diabetes have a higher prevalency of certain autoimmune diseases. So that's called in medical parlance a comorbidity, meaning these diseases cluster together. Now it's interesting when you think about that, you say, well, do they just cluster together by chance? Or do they cluster together because they share some common cause? And so then when you ask that question, then you say, well, what happens when you have diabetes? Well, you have a lot more sugar running around in your blood. And that sugar, if it can't go into cells where it can be used as fuel, like it should be, it then is sitting outside and it's reacting with tissues of your body. And that produces what you have talked about called glycation. And there are, when you start combining sugar with proteins on the surface of cells, then you get this glycation endpoint or end product, which is actually not seen as what you're made of. It's a new material. And those are called advanced glycosylation end products, AGE. And there's an association between biological aging and the amount of these AGE proteins that are in your blood. Now, those are not normal proteins. They have been chemically modified by the combination of sugar with the protein. So now the sensitive immune system says, wow, we have a lot of foreigners that are floating around here, and on the surface of the immune system, there are receptors for these advanced glycosylation end products that will recognize them as foreigners. Now, if you think of what the acronym is there, receptors for AGEs, that's RAGE, RAGE. So when you have AGE proteins from diabetes, your immune system becomes enraged. And when it becomes enraged, it then starts to be hypervigilant and start attacking those tissues. So now, it's not that these are just happenstance comorbidities, it's that they're connected by a mechanism of making foreigners in your body.
One of the examples may be with diabetes, the function of the eyes.
That's right.
And because it's a sensitive tissue to the rage that occurs there, you see symptoms of it quicker. So diabetics will start having problems with their vision.
Yeah, I think that's a superb, and in fact, you've said something very important there, I think, for this whole story, and that is the tissues that would be most influenced are those that have the highest turnover. So we think of mucosal tissues that are in the exchange with the environment all the time, and they're being rapidly replaced. Like the gut mucosal tissue, those cells are turning over every few days and being replaced by new cells, or your immune cells in your blood that are being turned over very, very rapidly.
And then there's a second tier, right? So then there's dairy is a common one. Other foods may be people reacting to, and when you have a leaky gut, you may react to all sorts of different foods. And those can all trigger inflammatory responses in the body. So it becomes a cascade.
Yes.
So identifying dietary antigens that are driving inflammatory processes is really critical, and it's often ignored because you either have a peanut allergy or a shrimp allergy that's an IG allergy, or you don't have any real reaction to food.
Right. Unfortunately, that was the school of thought in the past, but so many of us still think that way. They think that if you do a skin prick test, and that's an IgE test, and if it comes back negative, you don't have a problem with that food.
That's right.
But there's other branches of the armed forces, right?
There are, and there's also a continuum, right? We often think on or off. You either have celiac or you don't.
Yes.
You have a true allergy or you don't. But there's a spectrum of responses
Yes.
that can lead to inflammation in the body that may not be what we conventionally think of as an allergen.
Yes.
So whether IgE or IgG or IgA or cell-mediated or innate immune responses that are harder to measure, these are all things that actually are real phenomena happening in any person. And it's often not just one thing, right? So we often think, well, it's just the one thing that's causing this. It's not. It's often a multitude of variables that sort of tip the body over into an acute inflammatory response.
We test and we optimize gut function. The other thing we turn to is one of these tests that looks at activation of the innate immune response, so the inflammasome basically. What is dialing up the inflammasome? This fancy term for all these chemicals that are markers of an immune response that involves inflammation. And we can look at that and what happens as our blood is exposed to specific foods. Not only foods, food additives, food colorings. You can do it to medications, you can do it to herbals, botanicals, you can do it to a lot of different things, but foods is the big one. So I have people at least do usually like a 200 food panel. It'll cover almost all the foods they're ever going to be eating. And then we look at different gradations of activation of the inflammatory pathways of their immune system from these different foods in isolation. And then from that, we can come up with a strategic elimination diet where we're going to pull out the things that they're most sort of reactive to, if you will, and from the standpoint of activating their inflammatory pathways. And if any of those big ticket items like gluten, dairy are hitting very high, we're definitely pulling them out, and they're usually out for the duration. They're usually out for the long run. In someone with a strong autoimmune history, particularly if they want to be really proactive. But even some of those other foods, even if they're more mild activations, we'll pull them out for a while. We'll try to fix that leaky gut, get them digesting better, maybe get them off proton pump inhibitors, lowering their stomach acid. It depends on the history. But then over time, we'll try to pull back in to their diet stream as many of those foods that they would like to enjoy as possible, but we're going to retest and we're going to make sure that they can tolerate them.
There's a whole laundry list of things, right, that you go through as a checklist to see if there's any coincidence in timing over the last few years of something that happened to you that then now you are suffering from autoimmune disease. So this is a little bit of a detective story, personal inventory. Then once you're going to start to identify those things, and even if you can't, then maybe you start just going down the list from the most common agents that alter immune system and kind of doing intervention in each of those levels. Remove gluten from your diet, get to a low glycemic diet that doesn't have a lot of sugar in it, get away from food antigens, stop using a lot of chemicals as body care products. I mean, you start going down the list and you see what makes a difference. It's like peeling off the layers of an onion. And I think this is what most practitioners are doing now with the patients that are proponents of this model, is they're using some laboratory testing, looking at how the immune system is working, and there are now much more sensitive tools that we have by testing in the blood of certain immune-related functions. So you can use that as kind of a biomarker to see how you're doing. You couple that together with your clinical symptoms, obviously, and then you start removing things, and then you add back things that you know support the immune system. Is a person on a healthy diet? Are they getting adequate levels of things like zinc that are necessary for the immune system function, vitamin C, certain B vitamins? Are they really then getting the things they need, and are we removing the things that are actually causing their body to look like a foreigner? And I think that approach is a whole different approach than traditionally how autoimmune disease has been treated.
We have a very elongated entry point. So let's say my patient, Melissa, who has MS, and she's a young woman with MS. So the first thing that's going to happen is somebody takes a quick survey on our website where we determine if they eat the top inflammatory foods. After that, they're going to meet with somebody who helps direct them. If they're eating inflammatory foods, and I don't mean specifically inflammatory to them because there are going to be those, but just gluten, dairy, sugar, that person is invited to go through a program, a protocol, where they're going to learn about inflammation and those foods and how to remove them from their diet before they could even work with us one-on-one. If they've already done that dietary cleanup, they're going to bypass that step and enter into counseling. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule. A child going through something, we're going to accelerate that whole process, but we want people taking that ownership and showing that they can before we're going to take the effort to work with them one-on-one, because we're right in there with people. We are not seeing the doctor once a month, once every 3 months or 6 months. We're in the everyday as nutrition professionals.
You have to deal with the lifestyle, their choices on a daily basis.
Absolutely.
And when they don't live the lifestyle or make the food selections that they know they should make, you're there to help figure out, okay, what happened? How come those choices weren't made?
Exactly.
How do we make it
lots
easier?
Of reasons. There might be physiological reasons. There might be psychological reasons that are indicated by or implied by physiological reasons, like candida or different behavioral things that are triggered by the physiology.
So candida is a yeast.
Candida is a yeast.
And it's got an exhaust, like all bacteria or yeast do, and that exhaust can make people crave sweets.
Exactly.
And so that's what you're referring to is when candida comes.
Absolutely, and those are, when we're talking about MS, that's often a trigger in the infection arena for MS. So going through our process, what Melissa would do then, if she's already done the dietary cleanup, is go through what we call our premier case review, which is 2 parts. I have a dedicated intake specialist on my team who's creating a very detailed timeline for the patient. So that first session is not about therapeutics. It's about working with the intake form and collecting more information. We find that the more time we spend up front really delving into that memoir, into those details, is what helps us to accelerate the therapeutics later on. It doesn't mean we don't have to do more digging. So that's a living document, that timeline, but we spend an hour just digging into history, no therapeutics. And then we assign that person to the right nutritionist on my team who's going to work with them. So for Melissa with MS, she came in to see me and said, I know that there's a connection with gluten, and I mostly don't eat gluten. Now, I'm sitting with the expert who can speak to the fact that 95% gluten-free is 0% protected. So that's a place we need to start. And then we needed to look at the trifecta that actually informs her autoimmunity: the genetic predisposition, gut permeability, and whatever infections were at play for her. And that's an ongoing process. Melissa and I have been working together for 5 years. She's mostly asymptomatic, but there are flares, and it's our job, coming back to those mediators, to determine what and why those flares happen so that we can keep her functional as often as possible.
I remember, for example, one chap many years ago came to see me with just irritable bowel syndrome, which is exceptionally common and in severe cases completely debilitating, but it doesn't fall into pathology. And he was been married for 30 years, and he'd never been more than 20 to 25 miles from where he lived for about 15 years because of his fear of being unable to move away from the toilet that he felt comfortable about having access to, because he had frequent explosive diarrhea during the day. But he really wanted to take his wife away to celebrate their 30 years of wedding, and so of marriage. So we intervened with some changes, which was modifying some diet, giving him some organisms that help to switch off these inflammatory markers inside his gut, reduce the intensity or frequency of activity. And within 6 weeks, he was making that journey to 30 or 40 miles. Within 3 months, he booked a holiday to Paris. Now, that's a very simple notion that an individual who's compressed and compressed and compressed his life to geographically 25 miles. Suddenly, 3 months later, we've liberated his choice that he can now fly to another country. So confidently is he in the way that his functionality has returned.
What did the change look in him? What kind of change did you see?
Complete disbelief mostly, because I think it's reasonable that most husbands do not come and seek health until something's falling off. So to come and ask for help, it was very embarrassing for him to talk about this. I remember it, I lived in a rural part of England, and it was very embarrassing for him. But I still see him now, it's just 10 years ago he did that, and when I see him, I just look at him and say, everything's fine. So having had the history, nothing can be done, all you gotta do is accommodate this.
So I was working with a man who had ulcerative colitis, and this is just kind of a totally different kind of a situation, but a man who had ulcerative colitis, he's on drugs to control his ulcerative colitis, and he came to see me and said, I don't want to be on these drugs forever. And so we changed his diet. I put him on what we call a specific carbohydrate diet, which was first popularized by Dr. Elaine Gottschall in her book, Breaking the Vicious Cycle. And that diet looks like what people can eat is kind of leafy vegetables, fruits, nuts and seeds, and all kinds of animal protein, and hard cheeses, and homemade yogurt. That's kind of the basis of it. And so we did that, and he got a lot better. And I recommended some probiotics, and he got a lot better, but he wasn't all the way better. So I asked his gastroenterologist to run a comprehensive stool exam. And what we found was that he actually had parasites. And his doctor treated him for the parasites, and the ulcerative colitis really resolved. And so you look at it and say, these things are often multifactorial. And his gastroenterologist, when I asked him to do this test, he said, Liz, he's going to be on these drugs the rest of his life. He has ulcerative colitis, and that's just the way it is. And now it's been about 20 years, and he's never had another flare-up of his ulcerative colitis. So I think that one of the really interesting things to me is that it's so easy for all of us to get complacent and say, well, this is what we know and we're good at this. But when people don't fit that mold, then the question is, how can I be more curious? And how can I keep asking more questions until I've held that person's hand until we've exhausted all the questions? Because there's always a key.
We see lots of drug names, from Prilosec and Nexium and all of these. In fact, recent data shows it's the second highest class of drug use in the United States at this point in time.
Wow.
Well, what they do is that there needs to be acid produced in the stomach.
Isn't acid bad for you?
Well, acid is necessary in order to activate the enzymes that are going to break down the proteins. So we eat proteins from a cow or chicken or fish, or from tofu, or from the nuts that we have, or legumes and beans. And we need that in order to break down the protein into the little particles, the amino acids that our body has to have for every single living function that we do. We got to have that.
So there are good acids, in a sense, called hydrochloric acid made in the stomach.
Right.
And it's the trigger that turns on all of the other enzymes
Precisely.
that break down the foods.
Precisely. So for people who they say, well, I have acid indigestion or reflux or GERD, we have names for these things. Right. It's not a disease, it's just a phenomena that's happening because we're overeating and we're, eating foods that cause imbalance to us. But anyways, even in someone who's eating good foods, if you're not making enough acid in your stomach, you can't break down the foods effectively.
What are some of the things that might trigger the inability to make enough acid? How does that happen over time?
Well, we know that chronic disease in and of itself, we know that the process of aging will decrease acid production going on.
So seniors may almost naturally or commonly have a lack of adequate hydrochloric acid.
How ironic that as you age, your acid production goes down. But if we look at the prescription of medicines that stop acid production, they're going up. So like something's not right there.
That's right. Many people are not producing hydrochloric acid, and that may have been over a lifetime. By the way, I remember reading long ago that colas, in general, for people that drink colas, can suppress your ability to make acids.
Yes, exactly.
And sugar, excess amounts of sugar, can suppress your ability to make acids. So the lifestyle that we may have lived in the past may have contributed to the mess we've got now.
Precisely. And we also can see that there are antibiotics that can decrease stomach acid production. There's so many things.
So I think the easiest thing for people to do is to change the things that they have control over, right?
Yeah.
So their diet. And most people have never tried an elimination diet, right? I don't even like to call it an elimination diet. It's really an addition diet.
Yes.
What are all the great foods you're adding to your diet that are healing? You're taking out the bad stuff, but you're putting in all this good stuff.
It's a great, I feel the same way.
So it should be called an addition diet.
Right. I agree.
It's not an elimination diet.
Right.
But that is one of the most powerful tools we have.
That's the title of your next book, right?
The addition
The
diet.
addition diet.
That's great. No, my next book is going to be WTF Should I Eat?
Great.
So it's really about looking at things you can do. So that's why I wrote the 10-day detox diet, which is great for sugar addiction, but it's also a powerful anti-inflammatory autoimmune diet, which takes out the common triggers. And in many people, it's gluten, it's dairy, but also I find it can be for some people grains and beans. And I recently had a patient who was a vegan and was trying to deal with her rheumatoid arthritis, and she was struggling, and we were trying to work with her and doing our best, and she wasn't eating gluten, she wasn't eating dairy, she was eating an anti-inflammatory diet, but it was plant-based. And immediately, as she took out the grains and beans and shifted over to a more diet that was more involved with using healthy animal proteins, still a lot of plant foods, good quality fats, her symptoms dramatically improved, and she's almost symptom-free, and it takes no medication by simply shifting her diet. So you have to experiment with what's right for you.
I think the most difficult thing to really translate easily is what is somebody eating on a day-to-day basis and why are they eating it? There are many reasons why people make poor decisions. So the first thing to do is, what is the intake of vegetables in your diet? Let's just start with that. Where are the vegetables being purchased from? Try to increase the amount that you're consuming each day. Don't have to go crazy and only eat carrots for a month. Try to choose a wide variety of different vegetables. Try to expand that plate, because of all the foods you can eat that will have a powerful effect on the biome and the immune system, and subsequent on you, it's vegetables. Then fruits. A certain number of fruits. I've talked about apples today, and certainly I like to add those in, but blueberries contain a high quantity of the phytonutrients, the chemicals that we get in there, and some bananas. You don't have to go crazy, just those three foods. And what I then look at the diet and say, what can I take away from this person that might be contributing to it? I want to make sure that they're not eating too many pre-packaged or processed foods that are high in sugars. And we try to keep away from sugars simply because sugars are easily metabolized by the biome, and it often produces a lot of unwanted gas, particularly methane. And those gases make people feel uncomfortable in their tummy, but it also has an effect systemically. So the first thing is, what can I add to make them feel better? So we can add some vegetables, preferably organic, but doesn't have to be. They should be bitter in taste if you can find them, and they should be cruciferous. That means they're crunchy or they break. So cauliflower, cabbage, kale, all those sort of green, leafy and crispy vegetables work well. Now, if you eat meat, then there should be a lean source meat, either chicken or fish, some red meat when they're starting off. Sometimes I exclude it, depends on the nature, but mostly we try to modify that, and we try to keep dairy foods to a medium to nil level. Some people just don't do very well with dairy, others cope with it very well. We can't make blanket for everybody because we're not just feeding you. We're feeding you and the trillions of cells that live inside you. Probiotics, which are organisms that we can take orally to improve the compositional ratio inside our gut, are also useful. Enzymes that may help to digest your food for you, like hydrochloric acid or some digestants for protein, can help. This gets a little bit more complicated now because you're asking people to make decisions, but fundamentally, look at your plate. 2/3 of that plate should be vegetables, 1/3 should be fat and meat or carbohydrates.
Profound food groups that have great impact on balancing the detoxification pathways is the cruciferous vegetable group. You know, broccoli, kale, cabbage, and
cauliflower and
Brussels
sprouts, right?
and a few others. And so we always get our patients taking these, and they seem to be better tolerated if they're lightly steamed or sprouted, and profound impact on the ability to detoxify. A lot of people that are toxic, you know, they're low in sulfur. So we give them foods that are rich in sulfur. Unfortunately, the cruciferous vegetables are rich in sulfur, but you know, a lot of people are deficient in high quality protein, which has the sulfur-rich amino acids. So we'll have people taking a variety of proteins that are rich in sulfur.
Do you mean like fish or
Fish,
meat?
yeah, free-range chicken, organic chicken, grass-fed beef, buffalo, whatever they can tolerate. And you know, if people don't react to dairy, we'll have them add an excellent whey protein, because that's such a great bioavailable group of proteins.
Meaning our bodies can use that protein very easily.
Right. And it's a great way to help coax the liver to make more glutathione. And then, you know, it's very important that people have adequate minerals, because minerals are cofactors for so many enzymes to work, like magnesium, zinc, copper, selenium, and so on.
Which is critical to have the minerals also. And you get a lot of that from organic produce, and the more vegetables and the variety of vegetables, you'll be pulling out more of those nutrients.
The rainbow diet.
The rainbow diet.
And then we can't forget about the oils, the vital importance of especially the omega-3 oils and high-quality saturated fats. I grew up eating curry and a lot of East Indian food, which I love to this day. But many years ago, I became aware of the active ingredient in the spice turmeric, which makes curry that yellow-orange color, and started following the research on curcumin. It really is the most profound inflammatory modulator, I think, on earth. You know, one of the latest papers on curcumin affecting molecular targets in cancer cells is 84. We don't have any drugs that come close to doing that.
Yes.
You know, our best group of drugs for rheumatoid arthritis and autoimmune disorders that have gone out of control is the tumor necrosis factor alpha blockers. That's one of these 84 pathways.
84 pathways that turmeric will impact on.
But these drugs are like sledgehammers for that pathway. They shut it right down. And in doing so, that sets the person up, predisposes them to developing cancers and infectious disease like tuberculosis. Whereas I view turmeric or curcumin like the master conductor in the inflammatory orchestra. You know, if you if you go to a symphony and sit down, the first song you hear is tuning.
That's right.
And
That's right.
you imagine sitting through hours of that. It would drive you crazy. Once the tuning is stopped, the conductor walks on the stage, raises his baton, and then you hear this beautiful music. Curcumin is the conductor.
That's a beautiful analogy.
It's not a sledgehammer, so it's not shutting pathways down completely. It's just bringing back that balance.
The miracle of nutrition is that you see it over and over and over and over again. The right person on the right diet for them at that moment can change everything. So, I think a lot of the physicians, we're so enamored of supplements and testing and going deeper and deeper, and we need people who know all those very technical things, yet it's also so important just to eat the right foods for you. And a lot of times these are therapeutic diets that people do for 3 months or 6 months or even up to a year or even a year and a half. But my goal is always, how can I broaden their road so that they can eat more normally? There might be a few kinds of foods that they can't eat for the rest of their lives, like gluten or eggs or dairy products, but what can we do to broaden it so that they can eat more normally?
You want people to have their lives back.
I do.
It seems like that just gives you a kick or something.
Yeah.
So thanks for listening to these words, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to take some inspiration from not only what I've offered, but from the many other speakers and guests who are part of the free online summit that Dr. O'Brien has put together here on autoimmune disease, and be able to take these words and be able to feel, how does this affect me in my life, and what can I do to begin to make some changes? And know that there's a community of people who are present with you, who are also listening in. Share it with your friends. Connect with them and say, what did you think about that? And begin to have the dialogue. When we make behavior change in our life, if we try to do it just with the force of our own will, we can do it, but it doesn't tend to stick. If you share it with your family, share it with your friends, have others join this summit with you, you can begin to make the changes and they will stick.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. It's amazing to see how much difference it can make for your health by just eliminating certain foods. We see it time and time again. Not only eliminating the bad foods to your body, but eating the right types of foods that can bring healing to your gut. If you're experiencing any types of autoimmune disease symptoms, make sure you get your gut checked out. You don't have to have gut symptoms to have your gut checked out. You don't have to continue on with this pain and suffering. It can all start with your food. Tomorrow, we'll be looking into the environmental toxins that are causing these autoimmune disease health problems. The episode will cover the dangers of toxins such as heavy metals, lead, mercury, arsenic, plastic, BPA, that's what softens water bottles, EMF exposure, that's the electronics we're all exposed to, air pollution, and many more. Join us and find out how you can protect yourself and your family from these harmful toxins.